Good evening, and welcome to this evening's book talk featuring Morris resident Stephen Drew. My name is Lucy Pierpont, the Marketing and Special Events Director at the Kent Memorial Library. I'm here to make some introductions on behalf of the House of Books and Kent Memorial Library. First, helping with virtual meeting assistance is Amanda Myers. If you are experiencing any issues during tonight's program, please type it in the chat and Amanda will be happy to help you. Tonight, Stephen Drew will discuss his newly published memoir, Into the Thin, a pilgrimage walk across northern Spain. He will share the experience of walking a 1,000-year-old road, the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, and its miraculous, mysterious ways. I will put the website for House of Books where you can order a book later on in the chat. But right now, I'm going to introduce you to Ben Rybeck, who works at the House of Books, and he will tell you all about it. Here's Ben.
Hey, thank you so much, Lucy. My name is Ben. As Lucy mentioned, I'm the general manager at House of Books in Kent, Connecticut. It's always a great thrill to partner with the Kent Memorial Library, our neighbors and partners in literary crime in this part of the world. So thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Stephen. I've been excited about this book and this event ever since Stephen first got in touch with us and told us that this book was coming out, and I can't wait to hear him talk more about it this evening. I want to mention that I know many of you will have lots of questions for him. If you do have a question, we will turn to them after the event or after Stephen is done speaking. And he will answer as many as we have time for. So if you have a question, at the bottom there, everyone's pretty Zoom fluent at this point, I think, but at the bottom you'll see Q&A, and just click on that and you can put your question right in there, and I will come back on and I will moderate and ask as many of them as I possibly can. As Lucy mentioned, you also can purchase copies of Stephen's book, Into the Thin, at houseofbooksct.com/intothethin. That's houseofbooksct.com/intothethin. And if you want a signed copy, I think Stephen and I should be able to work that out. So without further ado, as Lucy mentioned, Stephen Drew is here, and he lives in Northwestern Connecticut in Morris. And he is the author of this wonderful new book, and I'm so excited to hear from him. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Drew.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in or logging in or whatever you do on Zoom. But I'm so glad that you're all here, and also thank you, obviously, to Lucy and Ben and Amanda for the help in sort of getting organized here. I am not particularly Zoom fluent, so. Hopefully my Wi-Fi will hold up and we'll be able to speak uninterrupted. I guess I should tell you a little bit about the book in general before we get too far into it. This book is above all a deeply personal memoir that has a story which centers on the walking of the Camino de Santiago in Spain. Superficially, it's a travel log. A little deeper than that, a love letter to Spain. But most deeply, it is a story of change under the influence of grace. Now, as I was writing this book, the thought occurred to me a few times, wouldn't it be lovely if this inspired people to walk? And I think the feedback that I've gotten so far has indicated that it has that potential anyway. But more lately, my sense is something a little bit more specific, I guess, to memoir. That by reading my story, you may come to know yours better. I don't have the ability to know how this book will sit with anyone. But that is the magic of memoir, that by reading another's story, we come to understand our own a little bit better. It is not intended, this book is not intended to be a scholarly or academic discussion on pilgrimage or Spain or the Camino de Santiago for that matter. There is information in the book about it for context, but I have specifically avoided the didactic nature of how these things can sometimes go. So I guess having said all that, to understand the book, it's probably good to know a few things. Were we together in person, I would probably ask for a show of hands, and I'd want to know how many of you have walked the Camino. I know about how many folks are joining us, so I know there's a few who have statistically. And I would want to know how many of you were thinking of being on the Camino, and how many of you know what it is. And the majority of you would not have much familiarity with it. It's a pilgrimage that's very well known in Spain, less so in North America. So the Camino de Santiago translates into the way of St. James, and St. James in this case is the apostle of Jesus. The word Camino in Spain has a very, it's the way, and the way, a path, but that's in the largest possible sense. It's as in, the way, the truth, and the life kind of way. So it's all encompassing. The Camino de Santiago is one of the three great Christian pilgrimage routes in the world, the other two being to Rome and to Jerusalem. The modern day Camino began about 1,200 years ago, and it has been walked continuously since then. So when one walks the Camino, one is woven into that history, and it's quite moving. We around here we think of things being old when they're 200 or 300 years old, and in this part of Spain certainly many things are 900, 1,000, 1,100 years old. So you're touching history in this case. But anyway, the pilgrimage began in the mid 800s, and this began with the discovery of a burial site that was attributed to be that of St. James. He was martyred, I believe, in Jerusalem about 40 years after the death of Jesus. And his body found its way to Northwest Spain. There's a lot of mythology around that. But in the mid 800s, they found this grave site, and a bishop authenticated the remains as that of St. James. Now, it's really easy to get a little cynical about this, but at the same time, the Moors were invading northern Spain. And it's quite possible, I'll say, that there was some politics involved in this to motivate the people of Spain to do battle against the Moors and to retain the Christian influence of the Iberian Peninsula. There was probably in the medieval version of a rumor mill, there was some mythical imagery that was placed in with the culture at the time of St. James appearing in battle with the Moors on a white horse, slaying Moors, Santiago Matamoros, Santiago, St. James Slayer. So there seems to be a little bit of manipulation involved in that, but that is when the pilgrimage itself became quite prominent. The Camino consists of several routes, all of which ultimately lead into the city of Santiago de Compostela in in the northwest of Spain and the region of Galicia. And at the cathedral, below the altar in a crypt, one finds a reliquary, a beautiful ornate silver reliquary that is said to contain the bones of St. James and also that of a couple of his followers. The route that I took was the Camino de Francés, the French way, and it's the most traditional and most popular. The vast majority of people who walk the Camino, their first Camino is generally the French way. It begins in the French Pyrenees Mountains, in the town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, which sort of nestles up against the Spanish border. One begins by climbing a high mountain pass in the Pyrenees known as the Napoleon route, and crossing the Spanish border on the first day. One continues across the north of Spain through Navarra, La Rioja, Castilla y León, and finally into Galicia. So many pilgrims, including myself, do continue on after Santiago. They move on to the Atlantic coast, either in the town of Finisterre, translates into end of the earth, or Muchia, further up the coast. So it's not uncommon to do that. The Camino experience is steeped in tradition and customs all along the route. And as one participates in these, as I mentioned before, there is a sense of being woven into its history. Although it has an extremely heavy Catholic influence, it's a very secular experience these days. One finds people who are certainly of the Catholic faith, many who are not. Many who are of no faith. The symbol of the pilgrim on the Camino is the scallop shell. And the idea of that is that the flutes of the shell represent the roads leading to the base of the shell, which would symbolize Santiago de Compostela. So again, because there is a very heavy Catholic Christian influence there, that is not, it's certainly not limited to people of that faith. Each pilgrimage is unique. It's like a fingerprint. It's specific to the pilgrim. Each pilgrimage has its own personality, its own way. Some are based on community, where there's a lot of interaction and relationship with other pilgrims. Some are more solitary experiences, shared with relatively few, and such was mine. In my pilgrimage, I walked in company with others for the first 11 days. And when I arrived in the city of Burgos, which was the beginning of the section of the Camino known as the Meseta, that's when I went in a solitary pilgrimage from there on. There are three distinct yet overlapping phases of this pilgrimage. And typically this is how it goes. I like to look at it as three phases, three parts of the Camino with three different centering experiences. And here's what I mean. The initial part of the Camino, we'll say from Saint-Jean to Burgos, the first roughly 1/3 is centered on carnality, on the physicality of the walk, the surroundings, the act of this daily walk. The average walking day is 15 miles or about 20 kilometers. I was on the Camino for 39 days. 36 of those days were walking days. But the initial experience centers in physicality, and to either side of those, that experience, there is the psychological, the realm of mind, and the spiritual. As one moves into the Meseta, which is a long, flat, featureless sort of place. I have some photos of that for you later. The experience there, the centering experience there, is one of mind. It's about reflection and recollection and remembrances of a life, certainly in my case. And in my case, it was 60 years of living. When I walked, I had just turned 60 years old. To either side of that mind experience, there's the physicality and the spirituality. And finally, after crossing the Meseta, this long, relatively flat stretch of Camino, one gets into the region of Galicia, and it's about ascension. There's mountains there. And as one ascends, the centering experience shifts to that of something more spiritual, with physicality and the mind either side of that. And as my book describes it, it's pretty easy to see those general delineations. So it's all about the relationship between the inner and the outer pilgrimage. And I have a quote from Thomas Merton that I wanted to share with you. He says, the geographical pilgrimage is the symbolic acting out of the inner journey. The inner journey is the interpretation of the meaning and signs of the outer pilgrimage. One can have one without the other, but it is best to have both. So again, it's that integration, that holistic experience, the inner and the outer. So I will tell you finally, before I read a little bit of this book for you, that pilgrims are typically called to walk. And that, of course, happens in an infinite variety of forms. Some are quite dramatic, as my own. I'm going to read about it for you in a moment. Some are less obvious. I met plenty of people, for example, who thought they were going for an experience in microtourism. They were hikers. A lot of people had done the AT or PCT or a long through hike in their history. And they thought, well, this is pretty cool. I'll go for a walk across northern Spain. And they get there and something completely different happens. And they realize retrospectively that they were being called, that circumstances had set them up basically like bowling pins for this. So it's not unusual. It's actually the norm that people are called to this experience. So I'd like to read, if I could, from the introduction, which is always nice because I think I can assume virtually none of you have actually read this book. So the introduction is a great place to start. And it's also good because I don't have to set it up. If I have to set up the introduction, something's gone horribly wrong. So, this is how we begin. Who knows where or when anything really begins? A first walk that sets off across the living room carpet toward the hopeful faces and outstretched arms of mom and dad could eventually lead through to the high meadows of the French Pyrenees and beyond. Before all the different ways we found of moving ourselves from one place to another, it was always walking, ancient and perfect. So when difficulties come, as they must in this life, it is often the elegant movement of the walk we resort to in search of our answer, a way to consider, to reflect, to center our troubled selves. Maybe on a country road, down a path, along a winter beach, or through a labyrinth, The walk has a way with the mind and the heart. St. Augustine of Hippo once coined a phrase in response to a philosophical conundrum. It is solved by walking, he said. I read this quote not long after the darkness arrived during the long year of 2010, a time which I shared with my second wife and family, a time which begged for answers. The deaths of a close friend and mentor, as well as my wonderful father-in-law, the health crisis of a stepdaughter, the suicide death of my 28-year-old son, and lastly, the decline and end of my marriage, all conspired to create an emotional crucifixion. There was more, but these are some mighty big its to be solved or reconciled, or at least made sense of, even if it just was not possible. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to the description of how I was called to walk the Camino. I had moved to Morris, Connecticut, where I took up the habit of daily walking, something I found unifying of body and mind and spirit. So here's what happened. One effect of pilgrimage is that it slows life down. So it was more than a little ironic to me that this phenomena of calling happened in the space of time it took to walk a single step, one step only. As my foot lifted, the entirety of walking the Camino de Santiago and all of its attendant implications then entered my life as a complete reality. There was no sense of having a choice, no need to engage in decisional balancing, no need to even wonder how it could or would ever be. It simply yet definitely was now so as my foot returned to the ground. I remember I'd been leaning forward a bit as I walked, and that suddenly my body had straightened, that some kind of sound had lifted from my throat. Fear spontaneously erupted with a flood of thoughts masquerading as rational. Reeling from this, I continued walking as the fear eventually waned. After a time came peace and stillness and a thought that did not express in a voice, but if it had, would have sounded like a chocolatey, warm, soothing whisper. And it would have said something like this: live well, be at peace, follow your path. Know that when the rhythms of life allow, you will go. There is something there for you. I eventually returned home, got into the shower, and wept. I had never known anything like this, and frankly questioned my sanity, though the reality of it seemed undeniable. The route I eventually took, the Camino de Francés, the French way, begins in the town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port in the south of France near the Spanish border. It traverses northern Spain from the French Pyrenees Mountains through the Basque country of Navarra and La Rioja, and crosses the vast Spanish Meseta into the region of Galicia and the city of Santiago de Compostela. It ends at the cathedral there, in a crypt beneath the altar, before the mysteriously contained relics of Santiago, St. James, the Apostle of Jesus. The Camino experience is the epitome of pilgrimage, the movement in body, in mind, in deepest thought, and in spirit. It is about a faith expressed in leaving home and all that is comfortable and familiar and soothing to walk on ground unknown. So that is how it began for me. I had first come into an awareness of the Camino in the late 1980s. I had read a book by James Michener entitled Iberia. And the final chapter of that book was entitled Santiago de Compostela, and he spoke about the Camino as the finest journey in all of Spain. And it stuck with me. It didn't stay at the forefront of my mind, but it definitely stuck with me. Around 2011, it was the year after that dark year of 2010, my significant other, Diane, called me and asked about going to see a movie, which was showing down the road from where I live. The Bantam Cinema was open then. Sadly, it's closed now. And the movie was The Weg. Starred Martin Sheen. It was written by his son, Emilio Estevez. It was written as a love letter to his father and to Spain, and it was just beautiful. She had warned me, though, take a look at the trailer. This might be difficult for you. And the movie basically is about a father who loses his adult son. His son goes to walk the Camino. Some kind of accident happens on the first day out. He dies, and his father has to go to France to reclaim his or claim his remains. Ends up having him cremated and carries the ashes across the Camino. It's a beautiful story, photographed beautifully. It is on the French route. If you've ever seen this movie, that's the route that I walked. So I wouldn't say that the movie directly inspired me to walk, but it definitely brought it up into my present day awareness. And it was the following year when I was called, as I just read to you. I'd like to do one more reading. A typical day on the Camino goes something like this. You wake up in the morning in whatever accommodation you're in, be it a hotel rustica or an albergue of some kind. Wake up in the morning and pack the bag and shoulder the bag and walk and see what happens. And that's the essential thing. That's basically what one does on pilgrimage. We don't know what's before us. That's kind of the whole point. Every step we take is on ground unknown. And it's a matter of what happens in the course of the walk. So what I would say is that this paragraph that I'm about to read is a pretty good example of what can happen along the way. It's pretty typical, actually. I was walking with a German man. This is in the first 11 days of the Camino. We were probably out on the road for about a week or so when this happened. We had just left Santo Domingo de la Calzada, and we were transitioning from the region of La Rioja into Castilla y León, which is the biggest region in all of Spain, and it takes up the bulk of the middle of the Camino. We were walking, and this is what happened. Before resuming its proximity to the highway, the Camino zigzags a bit, and contained in my view for a time, I see between 1 and 2 kilometers of the path's blonde dirt ahead as it courses through the deep green slopes. All along its track are pilgrims, perhaps 30 or so, in small clusters or alone, spread out and moving westward. For just a bare moment, for just the briefest fraction of a footstep on a Morris road of a moment, I see it all differently. No longer do I see pilgrims, I see pilgrimage, a movement towards something, a movement away, a movement of grace. I realize in this moment I am not apart from them or they from me. I am in no way living in opposition to them. I am them. And in the larger context of life beyond the Camino, all the competing needs and desires, all the conflicting interests, all the wounds inflicted and received, all the differences of body and thought and language, and most certainly of religion, are revealed as only mistaken notions of things. Elegies of separation become expressions of compassionate oneness along this thin, magical road to Santiago. Realization loves to dance here, to be glimpsed, even if only in the briefest of flashes. A couple of things I would comment about that is when you have that kind of an experience, you can't unexperience it. It's the kind of thing that stays forever. and changes an awful lot of how we look at the world. And as I was writing the book, it didn't occur to me when this happened. It didn't occur to me for some time, until sometime later when I was writing. But I realized that Thomas Merton, the Cistercian monk, had a very similar experience on a street corner in Louisville, Kentucky. He was out doing errands for the monastery and had almost precisely the same experience, where he saw all of these people and he loved them as himself. So these are the kinds of experiences that one can have, and that talks about the thin place, the places where the veil between matter and spirit are very, very thin. And I would submit that they are not limited to geography. I did not have to be on the Camino de Santiago to have that happen. That happened here, just in the same way that it happened for Merton. It wasn't about location. So I guess at this point, why don't we look at some photos? Because I'm looking at the time and I know we want to do Q&A. So Amanda, you want to bring some photos up and we'll start going through those. Okay. So this kind of says a lot, and those close to me know about that. Going back to the swear jar thing, there's an obsession that happens when one is called to the Camino. It can happen, it doesn't always happen. But I talked about this a lot before I went and immediately after I came home. People close to me were wondering if the Camino would ever end. And of course, that's a huge question, but I put this in here as a point of humor, but it always reminded me of Richard Dreyfuss in the movie Close Encounters, where he's called to go meet the extraterrestrials, and he's building models of Devil's Tower everywhere. So that's what that's all about. So moving on, this first photo is the town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port. This is in the south of France. Beautiful little town. In the distance, you can see the Pyrenees, and the town is just sort of nestled in there. Immediately after leaving, the climbing begins. The first elevation gain, the first day of the Camino on the Française route, on the French route, is the hardest day. It is breathtakingly difficult. The weather can change like it does on Mount Washington. And the length of the walk is about 24 kilometers. I should say the overall length of the Camino is about 500 miles or 800 kilometers. That would have probably been good to tell you before. Okay, for the next one, this was my view as I left Saint-Jean on the first day of walking. It's about 6 o'clock or so in the morning, 6 or 7 o'clock, and I'm heading to the Spanish Gate on the western side of town. After about 5 or 10 minutes of walking, the next photo, this is the kind of scenery one sees. Now, as lovely as this looks, I mentioned that the weather changes dramatically. Probably within 5 minutes of taking this photo, I was in driving rain. And in the book, I describe it as walking waist deep in a swimming pool. It was unbelievable. So there was no photography for quite some time until I got into the high meadows, which is the next photo. The main weather feature here, you can see the sky is cleared up and it's just beautiful. Time-wise, this is probably 2 or 3 hours later. The feature for the remainder of the walk through this high pass was wind to the tune of 70 kilometer per hour gusts. In fact, one fellow was actually blown off the Camino and fell about 30 meters. Fortunately, he was not seriously hurt. But that first day, you will not forget the first day on the Camino. I promise you that. Okay, the next photo is moving along. This is a street scene in Pamplona. I just kind of ducked out on the balcony real quick and shot this. This is in the old city, Pamplona. And the one thing I would say about this place, this is where they do the famous running of the bulls in July. I was here in April. Pretty quiet, but still quite the party town, Pamplona. And but it is immaculate. It is an absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous city. The next photo will be familiar to anybody who's seen the cover of the book. This is a place called Guendo Lane. It is just west of Pamplona. And I was quite insistent, and my publisher was kind to incorporate this into the cover design. I really wanted this photo to be the basis of the book cover. And I would love to have the time to read, but I don't. It is, this was the place where the title was born, where I began to wonder, you know, this is a thin place. Is this what heaven looks like? To stand here, this photo does not do it justice. The air itself was illumined by these mustard blooms, and it was just remarkable. So that is actually the basis of the cover photo. Moving along, we continue climbing up off the plains west of Pamplona. In the distance, you can see the outskirts of Pamplona, along with the mustard patches, and just a beautiful, beautiful photo. There's really nothing more to it than that. The following photo is actually a picture. This is quite a famous statue. It's oxidized metal. It depicts a band of pilgrims making their way. Really quite touching. That entire ridge behind my perspective here as I'm taking this photo, there's an entire ridge full of wind generators. There's quite a few of those in Spain. And the power company actually commissioned this art. It's quite lovely. Moving on, I believe the next one, yes, this is the very famous bridge on the Camino. Puente la Reina is the name of the town and the bridge in Spanish. That's Bridge of the Queen. It was commissioned by a queen about 900 years ago. It seems the ferrymen were taking advantage of pilgrims who wanted to cross that river. So she circumvented that by having this bridge built. It is a six-arched bridge, Roman design. It is stunningly beautiful. The next photo, these are markers along the way. This is kind of a whimsical little thing with not a whole lot of meaning to it, but I think in the year 2016, when I walked, this was probably the most photographed hiking shoe with flowers sticking out of it on the Camino. I've seen this thing all over the internet, but this is actually my photo. These are typical way markers, the yellow arrows and the scallop shell. And the shell always orients you west. The base of the scallop shell always points to the west. So you really, you can't go wrong. In fact, you can do this entire walk without the benefit of a guidebook. It's not recommended, but it's so well marked, you could actually make your way without a guidebook. The next photo is a pretty typical look at the Camino. This is between Puente la Reina and Estella. The gentleman on the right is my friend Heinrich. Should you read my book, you'll read a lot about Heinrich. He's the fellow I walked with for 11 days. He's walking with a young Muslim girl from Isle of Wight, and ahead is Greg. And this is significant because this is where Greg began to pull ahead of us. And we did not see him after this. He was on a much different time constraint than Heinrich and I were. In the distance is the hilltop town of Siraki. So that's just a scene from the road. The next photo is the retablo behind the altar at Santa Maria de los Arcos. These retablos, this is actually typical of the retablos, the backing artwork to the altars, generally made of carved wood painted gold. Next photo is just a random winding Camino photo moving through the landscape. I'm getting real close to Q&A time. I am mindful of that. The next two photos are the meseta. This is pretty typical landscape in the meseta, very flat. There's some mesas, but for the most part, it's a very flat, boring experience. Perfect for introspection. The feature here is the sky. It's all about the sky. Big as all Montana, as I like to say, and it is just stunning. I would also tell you that I went in April, May, and I finished up in early June on the coast. These colors are spectacular, and they are only visible in the spring. If you go in the summer or in the fall, everything that you see here is green, is sort of a dusty blonde color. So it gets kind of bland later on in the year. Let's see, next I believe that's the cathedral in Leon, which is a fairway across it's one of the great meseta cities on the Camino. I had a 2-day rest stop there. The following picture is just one that I always found visually striking because of the colors. It's right after a rainstorm. You can see the clouds moving off to the north. That's on the road to Fromista. The following photo is just some pilgrims walking into the town of Catalina de Somoza, heading up to Cruz de Ferro. The next photo is, I believe, of Cruz de Ferro, the Iron Cross. This is a very significant place on the Camino. I wish I had more time to tell you about it. It's the place where stones are symbolically left as a release of burden. Beautiful, beautiful place. And the following photo is something that I just happened upon after leaving Cruz de Ferro. It sort of speaks for itself. This is northern Spain in May at this point. Next photo this is the Knights Templar Castle in Ponferrada. There is a renovated to tourist trap quality section of the castle, which I immediately bypassed and came here to the original section. Remarkable place, just loaded with history. The next photo, this is a view from the top of Osobrero, which is the first town one hits in Galicia. This is the beginning of the experience of ascension, and a significant experience happened to me here that I write about in the book. Following photo is the cathedral in Santiago. This is the Cathedral of St. James. In 2016, they were doing renovation work on the exterior. They finished that since then and have moved to the interior. So that's still a work in progress, as are most of the pilgrims who go there. Getting near the end, one more photo. This is the reliquary in the crypt underneath. This is the object, the physical object of the pilgrimage, the reliquary containing the believed to be the bones of St. James. Next photo is out at the coastline. This is Finisterre, an area north of Finisterre along the coast known as Castro Mignon. You can see why the Celts loved the area and why they tended to settle here. It reminds me so much of the coast of Ireland. And finally, last photo is sunset at Finisterre. This photo was taken at 10 p.m. In early June. That's the time for sunset in Spain. And it is a custom for pilgrims who travel to Finisterre to go to sunset. So done with photos. Thank you, Lucy, for the suggestion of including those. And I'd love to take some questions. Answers are not guaranteed, but responses are assured.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing the words
You
from your
bet.
book. Thank you for the photographs. As Stephen mentioned, we're taking questions now. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, type it in the Q&A function down below. Just click on Q&A and type your question in. If you don't want to do that, you can do it over in the chat too. That's okay. I'll see it either way. But the first question, Stephen, comes from Paul. And he's wondering something about sort of the genesis of the book in particular. How long did you take to write the book, and had you had anything else previously published? What made you? I mean, I guess I'm saying, what made you? If I can add to Paul's question, what made you feel like you could tackle this as a book project?
Thank you, Paul, for the question. It was an interesting process. I had not had anything published before. I mentioned that I first became aware of the Camino in the late 1980s. At the time, I was going through a very tumultuous period in my life when I read Michener's book. And it's interesting to me, and I only realized this recently, that I began to realize back then that I could write, that I had a writing voice. At the time, I was going through some very difficult personal issues. And what was coming out as what I was writing was basically garbage. So I had beautifully written garbage. And I set that aside. And it's interesting that that writing voice came back after the burnishing of a few decades of living, that writing voice came back along with the experience of the Camino. So while I was in Spain, I wrote a travel blog, basically as a gift back, because I felt so blessed and fortunate to be able to go. I wanted to share it with others. And while I wrote that blog, it was all first-person narrative and first-person photos, not a single selfie in the entire blog. What I saw, my followers saw. And when I came back, I kept running into people. And they would say things like, so have you started the book yet? You're going to write, right? And you know, after several of these, I began to think, well, maybe I'm being told something here. So I sat to write. And I guess I had accumulated about 4,000 or 5,000 words, and I realized that I had something here. So I made an agreement with the Muse. I said, I'll show up to work every day, and I'll listen carefully. And I'll craft the best book that I can possibly craft. And I will do whatever I have to do to put eyes on the page. That was my deal with it. So thank you for the question, Bill.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question from Jane. Jane is wondering, how many miles did you walk a day, and how many days did your pilgrimage last? And I'm going to actually fold that in with another question from Helen, because these are both practical questions.
Yep.
Did you ever have to arrange your accommodations ahead of your trip?
Ahead of the trip, no. In fact, one does not have to arrange anything. You can wake up in the morning and just decide where it's going to end as you walk. I got to the point, it got a little crowded there for a while, and I got to the point where I would book a day or so ahead using the information in my guidebook for that. The average daily walk is somewhere between 15 and 20 miles. And the total amount of time that I was on the Camino between Saint Jean and Santiago de Compostela was 39 days. 36 of those days were walking days. I took one rest day in Burgos and 2 rest days in León. And then I traveled out to Finisterre and spent 9 days hiking along the coastline sort of trying to figure out what had just happened. But that's basically it. But you can arrange accommodations ahead, or you can do it pretty much on the fly as you go. Something always shows up. That's really not a problem.
So question here from Iris. And she's referencing she references the photo of the first day of your walk, and it has made her wonder, what were your emotions and thoughts that morning? And how did those emotions at the beginning compare to the emotions at the end of your journey when you took your last steps on the Camino?
That's a wonderful question. Oh my. And I'm going to try to answer this as best I can. I'm going to read the end of the prologue before chapter 1 to answer the first part of that question. I wanted to leave in the pre-dawn light, the vague gray light that speaks of beginnings and new things, a light that invites but promises nothing, a light seemingly intended for the relatively few, my kind of light. After leaving my room key at the empty desk in the lobby, I stepped out into the street, shouldered my pack, and made my way to Rue de la Citadelle in the cool, dark, lonely morning. I walked down the hill and across the canal bridge, able to see almost the entire narrow street before me as it faded to a point. The tapping of my sticks on the street echoed on stone walls and shop windows as I moved through the silent, sleeping town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port toward the Spanish Gate on the western side of the old city. Beyond were the first steps of the Camino de Santiago. There was tremendous anticipation. And on the first day of the walk, within 5 kilometers of that first difficult climb in France, moving toward Santiago, moving toward the Spanish border, I asked myself, my God, what have I done? Because I just couldn't imagine taking one more step. The weather was horrible. The wind was howling. It was exactly what was presented to me. And all I was ever told by people who had gone before me was like, no matter what, keep on walking. And that's what I did for 500 miles. And by the time I got to the end, many of the things that I brought to the Camino found a resolution. And there were things that I had not ever intended to look at that arose in the course of that still remained to be worked out. And I wish I had more time to get into that answer. I know we're pressed, but that was the basic flow of it. And thank you. I believe it was Iris. Thank you.
Iris. And a question from Jorge. He wants to know if you've ever had the opportunity to revisit Spain and walk another pilgrimage.
That is the plan. I have not been able to as yet. In fact, I had originally intended something for next year, but I think that's a little ambitious given the troubles that we're all having. So at this point, I plan to return in the spring of 22. And the goal at this point is to walk the Camino del Norte, which is along the coastline of the Bay of Biscay, join into the Camino Primitivo, and walk into Santiago on that. So there's another one in the plan, yeah.
I think we might have time for one last question. I'm going to turn it to Peter, a question from Peter, who was wondering in a general sense, can you speak a bit more to the concept of the thin?
Sure. So the idea is it's an old Celtic term, thin places. You find it in Celtic mythology. At least that's what my reading has told me, rudimentary as it is. The idea of thin places, that there are places, in the world where the veil between, or the separation between matter and spirit is remarkably thin, that it almost allows us to reach across and have a transcendent experience. And that is probably, there's probably an element of truth to that. For me, it was a matter of perception. And what I found was that the thin place is something that is close as my breath. Like in Thomas Merton's case, where it could happen on a busy street corner, or me in a mustard field near Pamplona, or climbing a mountain in Osabrero. Any number of ways that could happen, but I think it's more a state than a place. At least that's what I've come to understand from it. Yeah.
It's wonderful, Stephen. Thank you so much for this. I just want to mention that you have a lot of fans out there. I'm seeing here lots of comments for you, thanking you for this evening.
Well, thank you. I have one more thing, if I could have 20 seconds for this.
Absolutely, please.
There is a book. It's called Returning from Camino. It's written by Alexander John Shaya. And I consider this as essential, if not more essential, than a guidebook. There are hundreds of books written about the Camino, memoirs, guidebooks, fiction work. There is one book that you will find about returning from Camino, how to integrate that experience into life going forward. I wish this had been available when I walked. Full disclosure, Alexander John Shaya is a friend of mine, and you will find his blurb on the back of my book. So I just want to make sure that I'm completely upfront and honest. That does not take away from the fact that this book is an essential book for anyone thinking about walking the Camino de Santiago.
Wonderful. And of course, another essential book, Into the Thin. Thank you so much, Stephen, for this presentation this evening.
Thank you.
To buy a copy of the book, please visit houseofbooksct.com/intothethin. And if you'd like a signed copy, Stephen, I think we can arrange that, right?
Oh, most definitely.
Oh, please do.
We must celebrate and support independent booksellers, by golly,
Well,
at
thank
all
you.
costs. You bet,
Thank you
brother.
so much. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to the library, as always, for partnering with us on this and so many other events. And have a wonderful and safe night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.